We began last time trying to delve into the subject of reconciling Torah with the consensus of modern science. We touched on the subject of trying to reconcile the age of the universe question, where Torah seems to imply or to indicate the world or the universe is around 6,000 years old. The modern scientific consensus is somewhere in the neighborhood of 13.8 billion years, 15.4 billion years, which is a large enough discrepancy to raise some eyebrows. We did propose several ways of trying to resolve that contradiction. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But before we begin, I want to address a fundamental question. Must we reckon with what heretics think? Are we perhaps, by having this discussion, are we giving legitimacy to heretics and heresy? Do we say, oh, you know what, do we have to make ourselves fit into their worldview? Maybe they should fit into our worldview. Why do we need to bend over backwards to accommodate them? Let them accommodate us. Maybe we should simply say, we don't care what science has to say. Not in this matter. Not in any matter. We have Torah. Why must we reckon with science? And I think there is good reason to be skeptical, maybe even a bit cynical, of current scientific consensus. You know, we have yet to alter a word of Torah. They found the Dead Sea Scrolls and they compared them to our Torah, and they're identical. There's never been a time in history that we've had to have a revision of Torah where something was disproven, where some new evidence surfaced that caused a crisis. We've never had that. It's the same thing, and we don't plan on changing it. Whereas science has proposed, adopted, and subsequently discarded theory upon theory upon theory. They've been wrong again and again. In fact, I read a study. Gerald Schroeder, he's an MIT-trained scientist who wrote all kinds of books on the subject of reconciling Torah and science. He referenced a survey of leading American scientists in 1959, which included a host of questions. Among them was the question, what is your estimate of the age of the universe? And 1959 is not so long ago. We're not talking about the 1500s. This is relatively recent times. And 2/3 of the scientists, when asked the question, how old is the universe, gave the same answer. How old is the universe? The universe is eternal. It's been around forever. They repeated the erroneous conclusion of Plato and Aristotle from 2,400 years ago. And then a couple of years later, when it became evident to all that the world, the universe, is expanding, ergo it's dynamic, ergo it's not static, ergo it did have a beginning, that of course became silly. It was like a central tenet of the quote-unquote scientific consensus for more than 2 millennia went up in smoke. And, you know, there's a lot of theories or positions or beliefs that were accepted as gospel until they were disproven and they were discarded. I actually Googled the question. I found the Wikipedia article listing scores of superseded theories in science, meaning beliefs that were universally held by the scientific community until they were quote unquote superseded, disproven, proven to be untrue, and thrown away. Whereas Torah, the identical Torah, the identical written Torah, the identical oral Torah, even though, of course, the subject of oral Torah is something we're still going to discuss a little bit later, because the oral Torah is a little bit more dynamic. It can adapt to new situations. The principles, at least the principles of oral Torah, have not been changed. And we don't want to give off the impression of equivalence between Torah and science by trying to reconcile the two. And I think that's a good argument. People could say, listen, we have Torah. It's the tradition of our forebearers. It has not been disproven once. In fact, there's abundant evidence for its veracity. The scientific theories of today could very much go to the dustbin of history tomorrow. Why should we have to reconcile the two? I think that's an argument that people can make. I don't subscribe to that view for several reasons. First of all, there is an important midrash, very famous midrash, that tells us, again, it's based upon a verse in scripture, but the refrain is, if someone tells you there is wisdom in the nations, believe them. If they tell you there's Torah in the nation, don't believe them. This became a refrain. People say, Chachma or Chachma Bagoyim in and once the nation's tamen, that you believe. Someone says there's wisdom, there's knowledge, there's insight amongst the nations, that we do accept. Torah, they don't have. Wisdom, they do have. In fact, the Talmud talks about, for example, the question of a person or an expectant mother, they feel a little bit unhealthy, or they feel a little bit weak. Can they eat on Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur is supposed to fast. Can they eat on Yom Kippur based upon their feelings? So the Mishnah even says we go to the doctors. We acknowledge the wisdom, the aptitude of the non-Jewish physicians. We do vaccinate. We do believe that, there is science and the scientific wisdom, the scientific method, and there is room that the Torah even carves out for knowledge and wisdom by the Gentiles, even Gentiles that are not part of the religious ethos. We don't say, oh, what are the scientists? No, they don't know anything. They're injecting me with a little bit of polio. That's absurd. Just as an aside, I did find a Ramban that talks about vaccinations. The Ramban in the book of Numbers, it talks about the plague of the serpents. All these serpents come attack the people. So what does Moses do? He is told by God to erect this staff of the serpent made out of a certain metal, and someone is bitten by it. They look at it and they're healed. So the Ramban here, there he quotes, he's like, well, this is an interesting thing. We have serpents, and how do you solve the serpents? With serpents. And he says, this is the wisdom. There's a certain wisdom, he says, where you take the illness itself and in manipulate it in a way that the illness itself could actually tackle that illness, which is an interesting idea. I just felt like, wow, we see this Ramban. The Ramban is literally talking about vaccinations. That's an aside. But again, the first point of why I think it's important to wrestle with the subject of science and Torah, or at least there's validity to that, is because the Torah itself tells us that there is wisdom there. It is not all a bunch of bunk. There is legitimacy to it, and there is truth in it. That's number one. Number two, Torah has to jibe with science. Because we believe that the Torah is from God. Torah is divine. Not just the written Torah, the oral Torah. We also believe that the world was created by God. The universe was created by God. The rules of science and physics and biology, all of that is God's handiwork. So Torah is God's handiwork, and science is also God's handiwork. Therefore, there cannot really be a contradiction between God and His Torah and God and His world. They both emanate from the same source, and thus, by definition, we say that any apparent contradiction, is either a reflection of someone's poor knowledge of Torah or someone's poor or erroneous knowledge of science. The contradictions are only superficial. They have to actually agree. And therefore, the cynicism or the skepticism of saying, Torah does not need to cower to science, it presupposes that science is something which is outside of the godly realm, and we don't say that. We say God's wisdom, God's knowledge is captured in Torah. God's handiwork and His wisdom in the physical world is captured in science and in the world and in the rules of the world and what we could discover from the world, and therefore they have to coexist. And in fact, there's an amazing Rambam where he talks about the mitzvah of loving God. Of course, we say in the Shema, After the declaration of the Shema, the next verse is you shall love God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your resources. We're supposed to love God. And the obvious question is, well, we have a hard time even conceptualizing God. Yet we're told that we must have a deep affection, a deep emotion of love towards the entity that we have a hard time even articulating, even knowing, and understanding on the most basic level. So the Rambam has an amazing write-up of how to get around this problem in his book of mitzvos. The Rambam wrote a book called the Book of Mitzvos, in which he lists 613 mitzvos. Not only does he list them, 248 positive mitzvos, 365 negative mitzvos, he lists them in order of importance, in order of centrality to Torah. So of course, mitzvah number 1 is believe in God. And it goes on to deal with the more central, direct concepts of our relationship with God and the bedrock of Jewish philosophy, and then moves on to the rest of the mitzvahs. Loving God, says the Rambam, mitzvah number 3, right there at the top. We have to love God. But how do we do it? How do you love God? Says the Rambam. How do you do it? You think and you ruminate. It's 2 levels of thinking. Thinking, deep thinking. In God's mitzvos, in God's Torah, in God's handiwork, until you have an insight. And you have pleasure in the insight, which is the highest level of pleasure. That is what it means to love God. The Rambam sets up for us a path to loving God. There's 4 steps to it. You think, you ruminate. What do you ruminate on? What do you think about? He gives us 3 options. God's mitzvos, God's Torah, God's handiwork, God's world. Until you have an insight, until you have an understanding, until you have an aha moment, until something clicks. And the result of that is this incredible ecstatic pleasure. That pleasure is love of God. That's what the Rambam says. Again, if you were to ask us, what does it mean to love God? We would probably come up with a much different formulation, a different way of doing it. This is the process that the Rambam outlines. So these 4 steps, thinking and rumination in one of these 3 areas, insight, pleasure. And he quotes a midrash. He quotes the verse, you should love God with all your heart. How do you do it? I don't know how to do it. What's the following verse? Study Torah. It should be that you place these words upon your heart. Via study of Torah, you understand God, and via understanding God, you love God. There's a groundbreaking insight over here. The question that we asked is the question the Rambam is asking. We have a hard time understanding God, conceptualizing God. We're not even allowed to enunciate the name of God. Yet we're supposed to love Him? How do we do that? We cannot conceptualize God Himself. Says the Rambam, there is a workaround. We can connect to God not directly, but via His mitzvos, His Torah, and His world. Those are proxies for us to connect to God. And again, there's a lot of insights here, but insight number 2 is once you connect to God via those things and you understand, you have an insight, you have an aha moment, right away you'll love God. Meaning, He doesn't tell us to work on love. You work on knowledge. How do you get to knowledge? Via one of these 3 studies, via one of these 3 disciplines, if you will. Once you have the knowledge, ergo necessarily you'll have the love. Once you know God, you will love Him. Clear. But how do you know God? You have to connect to these proxies. And again, He gives us 3 options. It doesn't say just go study Torah. That's what I would say maybe. It doesn't say just go study mitzvos on a very deep level. He says, choose. You choose option A, connect to God via His Torah. Option B, connect to God via His mitzvos. Option C, connect to God via His world. In effect, what the Rambam is telling us is that it's possible for someone to be in the laboratory and to have the same ecstatic experience as the scholar in the academy. Provided, again, they're connecting to God and they're associating the experience with God. You could study the science of divorce from God. And by the way, you You can study Torah also divorced from God. You could say, wow, fascinating wisdom here from from Babylon in Aramaic. It's so stimulating. It's so intelligent. It's so clever. It's so wonderful. And not take it to the last step and say, where does it come from? It's from God. It's possible to engage in all these studies and all these disciplines and not connect it to the final step. But someone who does recognize that science is God's handiwork can connect to God via science and have this incredible, ecstatic, euphoric, climactic experience of loving God that the Rambam describes as the greatest level of pleasure. But again, this I think should dispel the notion that science is something which was hijacked by the quote-unquote scientists, by the atheists, by the heretics. We have no say in it. No, the Rambam is telling us clearly this is God's handiwork. It has to coexist with Torah because both of them come from God, both of them emanate from God. And by the way, by studying science, by studying God's handiwork, it is possible to actually connect to God on a very visceral level. That said, I want to add at least a caveat. I think there is a legitimate reason for someone to say, you know what, I'm going to avoid the scientists. Or at least maybe even to adopt the attitude of don't ask, don't tell, don't pursue with science. I am very comfortable with someone saying, listen, Torah is good enough for me. I don't need to reconcile anything. It doesn't matter to me what they say. And I want to say this carefully so I'm not misunderstood. Not because their positions can truly imperil or threaten our faith. Like I said before, I'll say it again. I believe that every word of the written Torah is from God. Every concept, every principle of the oral Torah is true, is divine. And it can withstand any sort of scrutiny from the scientists, from the heretics, from the atheists, from all of them. And that all positions and all arguments that conflict with Torah are untrue. But we also believe that the Almighty availed the possibility of heresy existing. There's always going to be room for someone to rebel, to reject. There has to be free will. And therefore, when there is one position that tries to discredit Torah, that's maybe popular for thousands of years, and overnight it is disproven, necessarily there has to be another option to rebel that has to materialize, because otherwise there's no free will. So in fact, what the Torah tells us is that there is always going to be room, at least, for heretics, and there's going to be a certain appeal, says the Talmud, of heresy. In fact, the Talmud tells us that someone who departs from heresy may actually die, because you could develop such a close bond with heresy that you become addicted to it, you become dependent upon it, and if you want to depart from it, if you're truly enmeshed in heresy and you depart it, you're actually threatening your own life because you developed a dependency for it, like a chemical dependency that an addict could have withdrawal symptoms that could actually threaten their life. What it's telling us is that there is room for heresy, and there is an allure for heresy. And we are not pompous enough to say that we're so intellectually independent and we're so free of any potential to fall in the pitfalls of heresy. We're not going to fall prey. We're going to study all the heresy just to know what we disagree with. It's quite likely someone who takes that attitude will actually fall prey to heresy and will lose their faith. In fact, the Rambam tells us a law in the Laws of Idolatry, chapter 2, halacha number 2. There's many books. This is a quote from the Rambam. There's many books that were authored by the idolaters, how to worship their idolaters and what it does and what its rules are. But the Almighty commanded us to not read those books, to not think about them, to not speak about them, and even to gaze on the idolatrous pagan imagery is prohibited, quotes a verse. And the verse continues by saying not only don't do it, but if you do it, you may be drawn after it. And therefore, the halacha is, the law states, we should not ask on the ways of worshiping the idols, because that may cause us to deviate and go astray. Jethro, is one of the intriguing characters that appears in the Torah. Our sages tell us that he was someone that experimented with all the idolatries, with all the methods of worship, with all the various pagan deities that existed in his time. Someone may say, you know what? I want to be open-minded. I want to be like Jethro. And I'm confident that I'll be able to see the truth from the fiction. I'm confident in that. We don't believe that that's the appropriate attitude because we don't rely on our own ability to be able to discern the truth and the falsehood, to not fall prey to the allure of heresy. We all know that heroin and meth is destructive. Despite the fact that you know that, it would be quite ill-advised for someone to say, you know what? Let me just try to get a sense of what these people are going through. I know it's destructive. I know that it's harmful, but I really want to understand. I want to help those people. I want to understand what they're going through, and therefore, let me just sample it. Of course, that would be silly because you're relying on your own fortitude to be able to not get addicted, and many have tried and few have succeeded. And that's the tricky balance that we want to do here. We want to demonstrate how Torah and science are not contradictory, and quite to the contrary, they're complementary, but we don't want to become a student of heresy along the way, which is why it's very important for us to not immerse ourselves too much in it, to really, really understand it, because we acknowledge that heresy is alluring and we are fragile and Torah is real and Torah is true. Anything that contradicts that is something which will eventually be discredited, but along the way we could lose our faith and we don't want to do that. So that's the introduction to the subject. I think it's important to have that in mind whenever we go, all these points in mind, that there is wisdom there, that they do coincide. Science is a way to connect to God, yet be aware and circumspect to not really go full steam ahead into heresy and hope to educate yourself. You may not be able to do that. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the various items in the scientific consensus that may be in opposition or may be viewed as being in opposition to Torah. I want to begin with the origin of species and evolution. I don't think that this is as compelling a question as the age of the universe question for several reasons. Number one, it's not really a complete theory. It's not really a full alternative to Torah. You can't really say, you know what? I want to avoid the miracles. I want to avoid the supernatural. I want to be more rational. And therefore, I'm going to adopt this as my worldview evolution. Because there's all kinds of parts of the origin of species that it does not address. For example, where does matter come from is not a subject that is within the sphere of maybe even science, but certainly not evolution. You know, the question of even inanimate matter, where does that come from? We have an answer in the Torah. And science doesn't really address that. It doesn't actually solve the question of where species came from. Moreover, the true origin of species is also outside of the purview of evolution because it starts with animate matter. It starts with the amoeba. How does the amoeba come into existence? Again, is outside the scope of science, which is their way of saying that's a miracle. Well, if both sides have to believe in miracles, I'd rather take the easier miracle to believe in than the harder miracle. You know, that idea of a single protein, which is, by the way, something that there's literally billions of them, billions upon billions of them in each one of your billions and billions and billions of cells. For that to spontaneously come into existence, it's so astonishingly, preposterously, absurdly far-fetched that to assume that it happened without some sort of miracle, which we would call intelligent design, we would call God, but even the evolutionists, even the scientists, they are not even willing to to go out on a limb, so to speak, to conceptualize, or maybe there are some, I guess the room for theoretical speculation is maybe endless, but there really isn't an answer to that question. And of course, that's not one problem. That's a million problems. There's a trillion species on this planet, and you have not one problem, not one miracle, but trillions of them. So the theory conveniently starts from point B. You have an amoeba, you have a single-celled organism, and then evolution will just turn it into an elephant. Sure, that's no problem. Good luck with that. But my point is, I think that I don't find it as much of a problem or of a question with Torah, because the amoeba itself is a miracle. There's miracles, there's holes in the theory, and therefore it doesn't bother me so much. Now, I think there's different ways of dealing with evolution and Torah. I think there are those who reject the theory entirely. They note that the evidence is kind of flimsy. There's all kinds of inconsistencies. There's been all kinds of evolutions to evolution. The Darwinian evolution has been discarded. The idea of slow, gradual change over millions, billions of years. Now it's more the punctuated equilibrium. Every long amount of time, there's this black swan event. There's this one event that changes everything. And enough of those things happen over the course of billions of years. But that's essentially a new theory. In addition, the evolution that you grew up with in biology class in 6th grade, the idea of survival of the fittest, the idea of the extinction happens to the less fit species and only the ones that are more fit survive. That was also discarded. The ones that went extinct, they went extinct for other reasons, not because they were less suited to survive. Think about the dinosaurs. These ferocious and powerful and intelligent beings, and some of them are extinct. Where's the survival of the fittest in that? And of course, there's other parts, things that won't explain. And there are those that take the approach of saying, listen, the whole theory is baseless, is groundless, and it's not true. But I think there's another way to look at it. I think we could say that even if it was true, or at least the basic building blocks of the theory are true, it doesn't at all conflict with Torah. Evolution is a description of the process of creation. How the world was effectuated, how the species came into existence. The Torah, to my knowledge, doesn't really address that question. The Torah tells us who created, not how he created. The means and the methods that God used are not really revealed in the Torah. You have maybe a hint of it over here and there. God used earth to create Adam. But again, what does that even mean? We don't even know. Can we suggest that God used an evolutionary process to create the world? And maybe they're not arguing, they're both saying the truth. One's describing, Torah is describing who created, evolution is describing how he created, and they're not at all in conflict. And I know this is not such a revolutionary idea. People have said it before. But again, there is an approach to reconcile it that way by pointing out they're not even in opposition. Maybe evolution is true. It's just that God is at the wheel, manipulating, creating one thing out of another, and that really solves the problem. And the proponents of that reconciliation note that if you read Genesis, and again, you have 1 or 2 chapters talking about creation. Obviously, it's not an exhaustive account, obviously. But if you read it, it does seem to have a certain progression from less sophisticated to more sophisticated. The last thing that's created is Adam. The most advanced, maybe. You could make that argument. There's also a Ramban, that actually in the very first verse on the Torah, the Ramban talks about the 2 kinds of creation that happen in Genesis. There's the creation ex nihilo, something out of nothing, which is only on day 1, says the Ramban. The rest of the days, from day 2 through day 6, the creation was not ex nihilo, something out of nothing. It was taking the existing, the extant matter and repurposing, reshaping, reformatting it into something else. And he explains that the word bara and the word yatzar, two words used to describe creation, one of them is creating something out of nothing, and one of them is creating something out of something else. And again, he tells us that day one, God created bara, something out of nothing, and the rest of the days he used the existing matter to make something else out of that matter, which again seems to lend credence to the idea that the things that were created were created out of something else. So again, it's not exactly the idea of evolution, but it's not too distant, and this is the Ramban, the most legitimate of all sources, that tells us day 2's creation, day 3 creation, day 4 creation, day 5 creation, the animals were made out of something else, not out of nothing. Okay, so that's gives a little bit grounds to at least the big picture idea of evolution in the very reputable sources. In fact, the Ramban asked the question. In verse 21, it talks about the great sea serpents or the great sea monsters. We don't even know what that is. It's a big debate what that is. But it's some sort of animal that's created in, again, verse 21 of chapter 1 of Genesis. And it says the word vayivra, bara. God created these giant sea monsters. Wait a minute, says the Ramban. Didn't I tell you that the creation ex nihilo, the creation with the word bara, is only on day 1? Why does he use in verse 21, when it talks about the creation of the Taninim Agdolim, the great sea monsters, or the great serpent animals, or the great crocodiles, whatever it may be, the great dinosaurs, whatever it may be, why does he use the word bara? And similarly, in verse 27, it says, Vayivra Elokim et Adam. God created man. He uses the word Vayivra. So the Ramban asked the question, why does he use the word bara, not the word yatzar? It should have said vayitzar Elokim or Tanim Agdolim, man. So he tells us, he says, because these creations were so important and so revolutionary and so out of the ordinary and such outliers in the Genesis story, therefore it's as if there's something brand new that wasn't existing previously. Yes, they were created out of something else. But because they are so different, they're so distinct than everything else, it uses the word to kind of highlight the fact that God brought something new into existence. It uses the word for creation ex nihilo. And yes, of course, he adds, all creation ultimately comes from nothing, because even the matter that you're using to reform into something else was initially created something out of nothing. So it's still technically accurate, but in order to highlight the fact that these are such unique things, it uses the words typically reserved for creation ex nihilo. It uses it even for things that were made out of something else. So again, the idea that the Ramban, that I want to pull up from the Ramban, is that there's these building blocks of matter that is created on day 1, and all creation subsequently after day 1 are repurposing the extant matter, using something and making something else out of it. And it does sound, at least in the broad picture, like what the theory of evolution is trying to tell us. The Ramban also quotes a Talmudic dispute in the book of Chulin on page 27b regarding what God used to create the animals. The Talmud is talking about something entirely unrelated to the origin of species. It's talking about why the method of slaughtering animals is different with the bird and with the animal and with the fish. Fish, you don't need to slaughter at all. The animal, you have to slaughter both vital signs. And the bird, it's only one vital sign. Why is there an inconsistency? So the Talmud quotes a opinion professed by a Galilean visitor. Someone visited the Galilee and he said the following thing. We don't know who it is. We don't know the identity of this visitor of the Galilee. We know the sages were in the Galilee. You assume someone came to visit. This is what he said. But obviously it rung true and the sages incorporated it into the Talmud. What did he say? He said that the animals were created out of the land. And therefore it's less spiritual and you need to slaughter both signs in order to make it kosher. Whereas the fish, they're created out of the water, which is more spiritual. And therefore you don't need to slaughter it in any way. You just kill it and it's kosher. And then you have the birds that were created out of the mud, half water, half earth. and therefore it's kind of the hybrid. You need to do one sign and it's kosher. That's what this Galilean visitor, what he posited. And the Talmud goes on to say, yes, I have evidence that the birds were made out of the mud, out of the half water, half earth, because if you look at their feet, they have scales on their feet. And that's the kind of the parts of them that are like the fish. They have scales like the fish on their feet, and therefore, yes, it seems to lend credence to this idea that they're this hybrid. They're like animals, but they're also like fish. That's what the Talmud says. And as an aside, you read that, and again, this is in the Talmud from 2,000 years ago, before the idea of vestigial organs was conceived. But this would obviously dispel that evidence of overlapping body parts of different animals. Doesn't necessarily mean that it came via some evolutionary process. It means that there's some sort of overlap, some sort of commonality, but that could all be part of what we believe, at least. But again, I think what we could clearly derive from all of this is that we don't know exactly how they might have created the species. It may very well be via some sort of evolutionary process, and we could resolve the conflict in that way. I want to add another source, another citation, a very interesting citation from the Seforno. Seforno, again, a reputable commentary on the Torah in the book of Genesis, chapter 1, verse number 26. The verse says, "Let us make man." Very famous, very problematic verse from a theological standpoint. Who's God talking to? Look at Rashi and look at everyone talks about that. But how do we understand this verse? So the way we understand it, simply, you read it simply, the way the rest of the commentaries understand it, say, let us make man and make him in our image, in our likeness. Let us make man in our image and our likeness. The way he reads it is a little bit different, but it makes the entire, again, once you realize what he's saying, you can read it quickly and not realize what he's saying. The way he reads is as follows. Let us take man and endow him with our likeness and our image. Again, he says it very clearly. There is something called Adam, a man, which is one of the animals that I already created. His name is man. Let us now infuse him into being this higher level of being a man who is in our likeness and our image. So the idea of proto-humans, the idea of humanoids, of Homo sapiens, of some sort of pre-Adamic man, i.e. pre-Adam, that you find in a source that is a medieval source in the Torah, one of the most reputable sources that we have on the Torah. You'll open up any Makros Gedolos, any book of Torah that has commentary, it'll have the commentary of the Seforno. He says that very, very shocking, startling statement that man was a previous creature that was kind of created twice, was created like as a regular animal and then created again, infused with this higher intellect, with this higher soul, whatever that means. So maybe the previous ones were the Neanderthals, the cavemen. Again, if someone wants to believe that, there is definitely robust evidence or robust positions to rely upon. And for those reasons, I am not as disturbed by the questions of reconciling evolution and Torah. I find it less compelling because there's lots of ways to resolve it that I think are, any way you choose, it's fine. If I have someone say, listen, I believe in the evidence is sufficient. There was evolution, but God was at the helm. If someone wants to say, hey, the Torah seems to indicate that, I think those are both positions that are totally fine. Someone could also say, no, God didn't use that method. Evolution is a bunch of baloney. I think there's also credence for that. There are some scientists that wrote some convincing books along those lines. But my general point is that the age of the universe question is a more compelling question. And last time we shared some reconciliations of that dilemma. We talked about the idea of the 49,000 year world. We referenced some Torah sources that talk about the world that preceded ours. God created worlds. He destroyed them. The Torah was created 974 generations before the world was created. Again, there's all these hints of a world that preceded ours. And we shared a very clever idea from, again, sages that are 700 years old or older, so not recent ones, not recent apologetics, that talk about the idea of the world being many, many, many years older than what it would seem from a simple reading of the text, maybe even to the tune of billions. So that we spoke about last time. I also mentioned last time the idea that the Talmud tells us that Adam was created as a 20-year-old. The world was created as a developed world. It wasn't a baby world. It was a developed world. And thus, we could say, if you took Adam, the day he was born, the minute he was born, and you took some of his cells and you brought it to the laboratory, and you would ask the lab, how old is this person? They would say he's 20 years old. Because the cells, they show the breakdown and the aging of a 20-year-old person. If you would say he's a second old, that would also be true. If you say he's 20 years old, that would also be true. And that's another way to solve the problem by saying, yes, God created the world 6,000 some odd years ago, 5,779, again, in the neighborhood of 6,000 years ago, but it looks to us like being billions of years old because God created it looking such. I want to share another reconciliation, another very clever one, based upon the Einsteinian theory of relativity of time. This approach was posited by Rabbi Shimon Schwab, was published in 1962, and it was featured in a book that I have a copy of, a book called Challenge. The subtitle is Torah Views on Science and Its Problems. This is a thick book, a compilation of essays on the subject of Torah and science. Rabbi Schwab was a rabbi in Germany. Subsequently, he moved to the United States. In 1934, he moved to the United States. He was a rabbi in Baltimore, later a rabbi in Manhattan. He was a very deep thinker, very creative thinker. And his idea was to focus on the nature of the 6 days of creation. His answer to our question, how old is the universe, is 5,779, rounded up to 6,000. 6,000 plus 6 days. And the general idea is that looking back on those 6 days from our perspective makes it appear as it was billions of years when in its time it was only 6 days. How does he come to that conclusion? So he begins his essay, and I don't want to go through the whole essay. It's a long essay, and it's also a little bit hard to read. I commented, I think it could have used a better editor, but the central idea we're going to try to share. He begins his essay by trying to avoid what he calls a sophisticated attempt to try to explain away these creation days as 6 periods of undefined length. He doesn't want to do that. He doesn't want to say, well, it's 6 days, but what's a day? A day is really a billion years. He doesn't want to do that. A day is a day is a day. We know there's 6 days. There's the 7th day, which is Shabbos. It's 24 hours. It's a day. That said, what is the nature of a day of creation compared to a day that we have today? As we mentioned, there is no sun that's regulating time until day 4. How do you tell time when there's nothing to indicate passage of time? So he, in a painstaking way, he reads Genesis based upon the Midrashic sources, and he quotes a Midrash that talks about a time system that was present at the moment of creation, and obviously not the same time system we have today. But he talks about the creation of light. Again, verse 3 God created light. Verse 4, God separates the light from the darkness. And verse 5, God calls the concept of light day and the concept of darkness night. And the transfer of time from day to night is what's called erev and boker. And he points out the word erev in Hebrew means mixture. And again, based upon the sources, the idea of mixture of light and darkness, like when it's dusk, you kind of see, you kind of don't see. It's half light, half dark. That's what's called erev and boker, where it's just light. And he notes that the Torah's prescription of days, of the transfer of days, is erev and then boker. That marks one day. And his answer to our dilemma of how old is the universe is around 6,000 years plus 6 creation days. And he goes on to say that we have this light from day one, which is not captured in the sun. And when it gets murky, it's erev, it's night, or it's evening. And when it gets bright, it is day. So there's something called a creation light, what he calls it. He calls it a creation light. And when the creation light appears and then stops appearing and then appears again, that is what marks a day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, day 6 of the creation week. So we have a unit of time, but the way it's defined is in a very specific way, the appearance and the disappearance of the creation light. Today, we have a different system of time, which is the rotation of the earth. One rotation of the earth on its axis is a day. And we also have the appearance of the light and the appearance of the darkness. That is 2 ways that we measure time today. But he points out from the sources that throughout that first week, the appearance of the creation light and the disappearance of creation light, that is what marked a day, nothing else. So what he speculates is that there's nothing that indicates necessarily that the system that we currently use today, i.e. the rotation of the earth on its axis as the day, that was the same system that was used during the first week of creation to mark the change of one day to the next. All we know is the appearance of the creation light and the disappearance and the appearance again. Is it possible that the earth turned on its axis 1,000,000 times before that light appeared and disappeared? There's nothing to indicate that would not be so. And he gives an analogy. It's a very long essay. He gives an analogy of 2 clocks. You have 2 clocks. One clock is the automatic clock. Another clock has someone who is manipulating it. He could be spinning it 1,000,000,000 times before that one makes one turn. You have 2 clock systems. And his suggestion is there's more analogies of speeding up time, and he's trying to convey a point, what we would call the relativity of time. His suggestion is that it is quite possible, maybe even likely, based upon some other evidence that he brings, that the earth spun its axis more than once every time that the creation light appeared, and maybe even billions and billions of times, billions and billions of years before it appeared again. There's no reason for us to assume any other way. And he quotes a Talmud, the Talmud in the book of Sanhedrin, page 38b. It gives us an account of the 6th day, the 12 hours of the 6th day. And it says, the first hour, Adam's dust was gathered. The second hour, it was formed into a shapeless mass. The third hour, his limbs were shaped. The fourth hour, his soul was infused within him. The fifth hour, he arose and stood on his feet. And then what happens the rest of the day? A flurry of activity. 6th hour, he names all the animals. Every single animal, we're told, Adam gave a name to it in 1 hour. The 7th hour, his wife Eve became his mate. The 8th hour, the twins were born, Cain and Abel. The 9th hour, he's commanded not to eat from the tree of knowledge. The 10th hour, he actually does commit the sin. The 11th hour, he is tried. And the 12th hour, he is expelled, or he's told that he's going to be expelled. obviously there's a lot happening in a very short amount of time, in a few hours. He points out, he's like, life in the Garden of Eden, naming all the creatures, creation of Eve, mating, childbirth, temptation, the fall of Adam, the expulsion, all happened between 12 noon and 6 o'clock in the evening. Obviously, the system of time and the limitations, the rigidity, the strictures of time that we have today were not in place at that time. So again, the speculation is, or the theory is, that the synchronization of the two systems, the two clocks are being synchronized. That is what he calls Shabbos. The fact that the creation light appears and the earth spins on its axis, and these two time systems are now synchronized, that is what he calls Shabbos, kind of the marriage of the heavenly day and the earthly day. And therefore, again, the argument goes that looking back as we do with the tools that we have to measure how many times did the earth spin on its axis, yes, that would indicate billions of years. But the 6 days of creation, the days were marked by a different system of time, the time of the appearance and the reappearance of the creation light. That's the only description of time that we have in Genesis. And again, there's reasons to believe that these are not ordinary days, even though in their time they are ordinary days, because an ordinary day in that time is the appearance and the reappearance of the creation light. If we were to have an atomic clock, he talks about the idea that maybe the earth was spinning a lot faster. If everything's happening faster, maybe the atomic clock is registering 12 hours, provided that my clock is working with the speed that we currently have, whereas it was 12 hours by our clock, but it was billions of years by their clock, because everything was spinning faster. Again, essentially he's taking the theory of relativity of time, that time is relative to the location, to the gravitational pull, to the acceleration, to the speed that something's happening, and thus it's 12 hours in our clock, but in their clock, it's spinning very, very rapidly. And looking back, again, using our clock, because our clocks were slowed down, so to speak, everything looks a lot older. That's the general breakdown of that theory. Dr. Schroeder, I mentioned earlier, he actually worked out the physics. He elaborated on this particular theory. It's not an essay. He's written multiple books. There's a book called Genesis and the Big Bang. I think another book he wrote called The Science of God. Again, he is highly credentialed as a scientist, but he made it his life's mission to try to reconcile these two. He worked out the physics of this general theory. His idea or his spin on it is a little bit different, but the general takeaway is the same. That we know that the size of the universe affects the relativity of time. So if the whole universe is the size of a marble or of a grain of dust, obviously time is happening a lot faster. And as the earth gets bigger, time is slowing down. And again, it's obviously complicated, but he writes the book for the layman. His basic breakdown is that from the Torah's perspective, you have 6 days, whereas from our perspective, within those 24 hours of the day, you would have 7.1 billion years in day one, and then the earth is so much bigger, so day two, time slows down a little bit, so it's only 3.6 billion years, and then 1.8, and 0.89, and 0.45, and 0.23, match those times together, and you have a very, very old earth. And he goes on to add that if you actually look on the days and his calculation of how long each day was relative to how we look at time, and you see what was created that day, you'll see how it actually matches, it exactly fits the scientific consensus of what was developed and what was created, how many eons ago and how long ago did this appear and how long ago did that appear, etc. So very fascinating theory. Again, I am not trying to say that any one of these approaches are definitive or authoritative, but I do think it's important for us to recognize that there's a lot of different options for us to choose. We should not become frightened when the scientists seem to say something which is different from Torah, we're confident that these two ways of connecting to God can both bring us to our destination. We don't want to immerse ourselves in heresy because it's not likely to end up well for us, but we could be comfortable with our immersion in Torah, with our adoption of Torah, with the knowledge that there's all kinds of ways of removing any apparent contradictions between Torah and science, between the origin of species and science. They could work together. They could be reconciled in any number of ways. And that I think it's a comforting thought, especially because, in our world, the science is taught as gospel and the Torah is not taught at all. And therefore there's an asymmetry, and we're trying to connect to Torah. We're trying to connect to our heritage, to connect to our soul, to, dare I say, connect to religion. And it's important for us to be aware of the idea that Torah is from God. His world is also from him. There is no contradiction. It may seem like there is a contradiction, but there's any number of ways for those to be resolved. And we need not worry of any crisis of faith developing from this. And again, quite to the contrary, the Rambam tells us, if someone wants to connect to God, you could take his handiwork, you go study science, you marvel at the amazing things that just exist within our own body, and you don't even need to get a microscope. Just think about how amazing it is and how wonderful it is and how fantastic it is and how just, the fact that your fingers bend, something as simple as that, how convenient it is. Put all 10 of your fingers in splints and try to drive a car. Good luck, right? And again, that is a process of trying to love God, to connect to God by noticing just how amazing he makes his world and how convenient it is for us. So that concludes, again, there is a lot more to say about it, but that concludes our study of reconciling Torah and science. Next time, we're going to try to continue our study of the 13 principles of faith, and principle number 5, which is the idea that one of the principles of our religion, one of the bases of our religion, one of the foundations of our religion is that there's only one entity that is worthy of our worship, and that is God and nothing else. My email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. If you have any questions, comments, feedback of any sort, I look forward to hearing from you. Our organization Torch's website is torchweb.org. My own personal website is rabbiwolbe.com. Check out all the podcasts on your favorite podcast app. Thank you for listening. I deeply appreciate it.